Hello everyone, hope you're all doing okay. So we're starting a new unit for this half term. We're going to be looking at poetry, which is absolutely fantastic because I love poetry and I think you're going to gain a lot from doing this. And you're going to be having a go at writing your own poems as well. So each lesson we're going to look at a poem together. We're going to really focus on our use of descriptive language. We're going to really focus on our use of things like similes and metaphors. We're going to look at literal language and things like that. So it's going to be really, really good. What I'll do in these lessons is I'll ask you to pause at various times to complete some tasks. The first thing I want you to do is just pause it and have a go at some of these questions. So write down what words you would use to describe the fog and what kind of atmosphere does fog create and how does it make you feel, and be inspired by these couple of pictures. So hopefully you've got some really good ideas there about fog, and you could maybe put in our chat on Teams any ideas that you've got. Let's move on. So we're going to look today at descriptive writing. We're going to look at literal and non-literal language. We're going to analyse a poem called Fog by Carl Sandburg, and then you're going to compose, which means write, your own poem. So our learning intention is to be able to analyse features of a poem, be able to write your own in the style of that poem. Okay, so let's move on. So the first thing to think about is often in poetry we get use of what's called literal language and non-literal language. Now if something is literal, it means that it is accurate or precise. So for example, if I said something like the carpet is green, then that would be a use of literal language because it's very accurate or precise. Or if I said something like that wall is really hard, that would be accurate or precise. Okay, so that's what we mean by a literal description. So the examples there: the fog is grey, the fog is covering the buildings. A phrase that is not literal is sometimes what we would associate with a metaphor. So if, for example, I said that wall is as hard as a rock, then I am comparing it to something else and I'm using non-literal language. So if I, for example, describe somebody as a couch potato, okay, that would be a way of describing somebody as lazy. Okay, so you can't actually have a potato, massive potato, sitting on a couch, but it's become a phrase that's used to describe someone as lazy. And this is used a lot in English, the use of these metaphors to really help us with our use of description. And it really is great because it creates a much more vivid description for us to think about. So rather than saying, Dave is lazy, if you say Dave's a couch potato, suddenly in your mind you've got this idea of a potato sitting on a couch. It's quite a lazy sort of thing, maybe just watching the TV, something like that. So it just makes it much better description. So here are some everyday phrases that none of these phrases are actually literal. So we've got a couch potato, we've got time flies, we might describe someone as a heart of stone, or if it's raining really heavily, we've not had a lot of rain recently, but if it was raining really heavily, we might say that it's raining cats and dogs. And then these are not literal phrases, but they're good phrases for just giving us an impression of how things are going. So for example, with time flies, if we just said, oh, that time passed really quickly, then it's not quite as effective as saying time flies. It just gives us that sense of how quickly things are going. So if you look at some of these phrases, raining cats and dogs means to rain a lot and very heavily. Heart of stone, time flies. Okay. So next task that I want you to do, okay, is we've got 5 key phrases down the left-hand side. You're a smart cookie, once in a blue moon, snug as a bug in a rug, it's a piece of cake, and pigs might fly. So I just want you to write down or discuss with your parent, if your parent's with you, what do those phrases mean. So just pause it while you do that. You can write them down, and I'll give you the answers in a moment. Okay, hopefully you got on okay with that, everyone. So what these phrases mean: once in a blue moon means it rarely happens. Snug as a bug in a rug means you're wrapped up and cozy. It's a piece of cake is something that's easy, and pigs might fly is unlikely to happen. Okay, just nice little phrases that we use in everyday language to convey our meaning. So, metaphor in poetry. So, we're going to study a poem about fog. So, literal descriptions of fog would be there was lots of fog, the fog was grey, the fog moved over the hills. Okay, but we would also maybe think about some metaphors to do with fog as well, which we're going to think about in a moment. And the poem that we look at actually uses a metaphor of comparing the fog to a cat, which is quite an interesting way of describing things. Okay, here's another metaphor. If somebody's really cross, you might say they exploded with anger. Okay, so again, gives us a really good awareness and idea of how somebody's feeling. So, next activity I want you to do, I want you to read the following and decide if they are literal phrases or whether they are metaphors. So, pause it now and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. There's the answers for you to check. So I was so upset I was crying. He smiled with happiness. He was so angry his cheeks went red. They're all literal phrases because they're things that are precise. You can see them. You know, so if someone's angry and his cheeks went red, you can visually see that the cheeks have gone red. If someone's upset, they're crying, you can see that they're crying. The other phrases are all metaphors. They're not literal phrases. So down in the dumps, steaming with anger. People aren't normally steaming when they're angry, but it just gives that sense about how angry somebody was. Gutted, I'm so actually, that should say I'm so hungry I could eat a horse, not I'm so angry I could eat a horse. Bit of a typo there, apologies for that. It's raining cats and dogs. Okay, so let's have a look at this poem called Fog by Carl Sandburg. And you can actually click on the link through the PowerPoint to actually listen to the poem being read, but I'll have a go as well. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbour and city on silent haunches and then moves on. So that's a really nice poem by Carl Sandburg, okay, just to give us that description of fog, which I think is really, really nice. So next task I want you to have a go at is to think about what is being described in the poem and what is it being compared to. So just write down some ideas that you've got there. So the fog comes on little cat feet, it sits looking over harbour and city on silent haunches and then moves on. If you're on your haunches, by the way, it kind of means that you're sort of like crouching down, so it's that idea that you're sort of moving quite quietly, quite stealthily, for example. Okay, let's move on. So some ideas that you probably had, just moving back to that, is you probably had the idea that the fog is being compared to a cat, okay, and the way that fog moves, which is quite slow, is quite kind of like cat-like. Cats are often quite quiet, and you don't always like hear them come in, and fog's a bit like that. So if you look at all of these words, they're all words that could be used to describe fog, but just think now in your mind which of the words could also be used to describe a cat. Some of you might have cats, for example. You might want to think about how your cat might be like fog. Great, so you probably found that there's quite a lot of words that you can use to describe both fog and a cat. So I want you just to go back and look at some of those words now, and you can rewind it back a little bit, but just write a paragraph to explain how a cat might be similar to fog. So just pause this now and then just write down that little paragraph to explain how a cat is similar to fog. Okay, well done. Hopefully you've got the idea that some of the things, like some of the colour of a cat, for example, could be similar to a fog. So you might have a grey cat. Sometimes cats are quite difficult to see because they move quite slowly, for example. So lots of those different things, the sort of quietness of cats are quite similar to fog. And that's why I think in this poem, the author of the poem has kind of used that metaphor of a cat to help us to understand what fog might look like. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is I want you to have a go at writing your own poem. So I want you to write your own poem which compares snow to an animal of your choice. So I want you to think about how you're going to describe the snow moving and acting in the same way as your animal. You want to keep your poem brief, so it's 30 words maximum. If it's a couple over, that's fine, but I want it to be relatively short. I'm going to think about where you're going to start each new line for your poem, and then you're going to hand that in via assignments. Now, we've seen an example of a poem about fog, which is compared to a cat. Here's another example of a poem. So this one is all about rain, okay, and it compares rain to a pigeon. So let's just read it. The rain taps down with pigeon's feet. It tips and taps in the city patiently, awaiting its turn to swoop away. So we've seen a poem about fog, we've seen one about rain. You need to write a poem about snow, which compares it to an animal of your choice. When you've written your poem, I want you to just edit it. So I want you to make sure that there aren't any run-on sentences. I want you to make sure that each proper noun that is in your poem begins with a capital letter. Have you used pronouns correctly and accurately? And have you checked your spellings? So just make sure you do those different things. When you've done all that and you're happy with your poem, then hand that in as evidence of your work for this week in English. In terms of review, we talked about how metaphors and idioms are used to convey meaning. Idioms are like sayings, like it's raining cats and dogs. Punctuation is important in poems, so you should avoid run-on sentences. So it's really important to make your punctuation correct, and make sure you're able to use capital letters correctly and spell accurately. Really looking forward to seeing your poems. I hope you got on really well with them. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening. And as usual, if you've got any questions, please let me know. Thank you.